So today I'm gonna take you on a journey which started 30 years ago, me on my trials bike, going out for adventure trips and on competitions. And in my 8 years as a pro trials rider, I finished up as vice world champion, double team world champion, and I also made it up into the Guinness Book. That was my Guinness Book record, jumping out of stand with a regular mountain bike over 1 meter. And back at that time, I had much fun playing around just with my bike, seeing everything as an obstacle. But then I had a broken leg, a really complicated broken leg, which forced me 1 year to pause. So I had to focus on different things, and that's how I dived into the world of cross-media art. Today we would call it simply multimedia art. I call it cross-media art because it's a big range which you can have access to if you want to. And I just figured out to dive into street art, then went on to light painting, where you take a long time exposure and just work with a camera setting and a single bulb, or a light source to make a long time exposure, where you freeze a memory of what you're just doing. Like here you can see a soap bubble that will be erased after 8 seconds. So you need to be really quick and have in mind what you want to do when you play around. And also, it's interesting then to dive into 3D animation, motion graphics, and renderings, going up to graphic design, which then led me to pen plotter illustration, because I was thinking about how could I use the tools to get something from the digital world back to the analog world. So the pen plotter is a perfect example for that, because it uses vectors just to get a print on paper. But still, there's the outside, the urban playground, and graffiti always had a big impact on my stuff. So typography and graffiti were always part of that game. And when you're thinking about the visual connections between all these different niches, you come up with audiovisual performances. Because then you have a real interaction of a performer on stage and the digital world which you create. And then there is another topic which is quite interesting, and it's mapping projection, where you go in the urban playground and use surfaces of existing houses just to project images on which you have in mind. So you can somehow force the audience to see your perspective from your point of view. And then there is another interesting thing about multimedia art, because you can force your tools to do something different. What you can see here is a picture from a pen plotter, not plotting on paper, but plotting on a glass plate with a fiberglass pen. And the fiberglass pen is then photographed from underneath, where you have a camera taking a long time exposure of the entire printing process, so you become out a light painting of a different tool, which is normally a pen plotter. But let's jump back to the very first picture, because there's a detail which I just saw when I prepared this presentation today. And there are rocks inside the picture which are covered by moss. And moss is particularly one thing which I will include in my next project that then went on and started 2 years ago. During all these travels, I was sketching a lot, doing calligraphy, typography, and all kind of character animation stuff just in sketchbooks. But I wanted those sketches to become something like street art, get it back to the street. So how do you do that? You scan your picture, make a 3D model out of it, put it into a software for 3D printing, and you get your first prototype, a 3D calligraphy which combines digital and analog in the same time. But I don't want to put that out on the street because it's a unique piece. So how do I get that piece into a replica? Then you have to investigate some time to find out that silicone molds work best to get a concrete casting from that model. So what you see here is a negative model from the 3D print in silicone, covered with a wooden frame, to get the concrete inside. And still there, the piece is not finished, because when you put it to the outside, to the playground, you want it to look old as it was there for years. So you work with acid and iron particles just to get it onto the streets, and that's how it looks like as street art. But then there might be some people in the neighborhood who don't like what you do, and they destroy your piece. So you end up with getting all these parts of your original artwork as a broken piece and put it back together. And then I was thinking, hey, how could I make it even looking much better that still the older people might like it? And there I had the idea of covering it with moss. Because moss can look green and dirty at the same time, so it could be something for the elder people. When it's green and when it's dirty, it's my style. And there's another interesting thing about moss, which you might not know so far. Because moss is more than 450 million years existing on our planet, and still today we have 16,000 variations of moss. And moss doesn't have roots, it just needs a structure to grow on. And it has a much bigger impact on our Earth than you might think, because it works as an air catalyst, as a sound absorber, and a hub for biodiversity in nature. So from that point, I dived into research how to grow moss on my own, which is quite a complicated thing. Even if you have tons of YouTube tutorials, it doesn't help. Because you end up with a mixer, let's say, where you put ingredients into, like moss, buttermilk, and also you could add beer because it helps the moss to grow. But still, it needs a structure. Because in the end, you come up with something like that, where you have a muddy tincture, which you then want to become growing on your concrete tile. So you have to investigate into doing an outdoor long-term test, which you can see here, where I made a horizontal and vertical growth prototype to see after 3 months if my project succeeded or failed. So each time you put into a new tincture, it needs another 3 months to see where you are. And at that point, AI came into the game. That was 2.5 years ago when I first started fooling around on a couple of different platforms with free accounts. And I was restricted to 25 images per month, because otherwise it's quite expensive. But I soon realized I have to invest into a couple of those pro plans just to get out what I had in mind. And in the same time, it's becoming interesting because their AI gives you a lot of new potential, which I call to work with my 11th finger. I don't see the AI as a threat. I see it as an extension of my tools, just by adding it to the tip of my fingers on the computer, by prompting and using style reference pictures to create a world which I had in mind. And the interesting part during that research was I found out that a Dutch company does the same since 3 years. So my whole research on the moss growth was basically done because they are more or less sorted now, coming up with a microgel product that you can directly put into the concrete, and it starts to grow after a while. So, but still then I had all these pro accounts with the AI. So what to do with that? And during my research, I found out a lot of more about moss, coming back to the theme that it doesn't need roots, it needs a structure. So I was thinking, how could I work on a modular structure to use moss or give moss the potential to grow on different artistic installations which I have in mind? And then I came back to another natural phenomenon, which is the honeycomb structure. Here you can see the hexagon, which is purely a 6-corner piece, which you could then extend by AI. By the way, these are bees from the AI, not from reality. But you could use that to extend it into a vision where you get out something which is more creative than just a repetitive pattern. And by more than 2 months, I had a collection from around 1,000 pictures around that theme of moss and concrete. And I showed it to a couple of friends, and one friend of mine works in Berlin at the Fraunhofer Institute, and he said, like, hey, I'm amazed by these pictures. I would like to put a student onto your project because he's in search for a project on sound absorption in the terms of finding the right structure for noise cancellation for urban city planning. So then I passed on all my research to that student, and he came up with the 2 different structures which would help the MOS to grow as a modular system. So when you think about modular systems, go out at the street and watch for flat surfaces of buildings. If you then have an extension module which you just could add onto the flat surface, you come up with a 3D depth model of hexagons inside a bigger hexagon, which could be repetitively placed onto surfaces of houses. And this is how it could look then as a module made out of concrete. Now, if you have then the ingredient from the Dutch company inside the concrete, you come up with something that could become something really interesting, because it's about a mixture between architecture, land art, and your own imagination. And that's just with the vision machine AI, which is my 11th finger. Just prompting and using the stuff I have created and remixing. It's a permanent evolving process. And when you think about a modular system, you suddenly come up with, okay, hey, there's even more to see, like the highway, which could be a sound-absorbing wall, just by the usage of different modular designs where moss can grow inside the concrete. Or use it as a fountain, art installation where the moss all of a sudden starts out of nowhere to grow from the inside. And the student also came up with a second different module, which is called the gyroid. The gyroid is a mathematical 3D depth structure kit that can be the best for sound-absorbing noise cancellation in city canyons. And if you use that gyroid as a module, and you then trigger the AI again, what do you think of the module gyroid in terms of combining it with a coral reef or something which gives a different artistic structure to it? The AI simply spits out really beautiful new pictures, which you bring then to another level of your creative thinking process. And in that term, you then think about how could I print parametric design, where you use robotic printing in concrete, where the concrete already involves the structure of microgel of the moss. So in the end, you could come up with really good solutions for new urban planning that give you a lot of different potentials. It could be a train stop, or it could become an art installation, which could also be a shelter spot for homeless people to sleep in the same time as being an air catalyst. And it could also be something which you just see in nature as a pure beauty, as land art, and still it is a hub for biodiversity. But also when you think about a parking garage, which is kind of boring from the outside, but useful in the city, you could extend it with tiny modules of living houses that just help the environment to reduce noise and to grow. And also it could become art and usability in the same time. And on the very first picture back then, moss on the rocks, how about if you go out the next time and just watch your street, how much moss can you find and how much concrete do you see? And it's about you seeing the 11th finger just as a vision machine that gives you another opportunity to think different and make our future better together. Thanks.